Hi, I'm Greg Tom, and welcome to the Community Advocate podcast. Today we're catching up with ACNC Commissioner Sue Woodward, who will give us the lowdown on updated advice for charities around advocacy in the upcoming federal election. Welcome, Sue.
Hi, Greg and listeners.
Always a pleasure. First up, how important does the regulator view the right to charities to advocate leading up to and during an election campaign? I know you take it seriously, but what's the ACNC's view on that?
I think perhaps the most important key takeaway is for charities to understand that they can advocate or campaign in an election period. It's absolutely fine, and often it's a very important tool. What they need to understand is where some of the sort of guardrails are, if you like, to make sure that they just don't stray into anything that could get them into difficulty with their eligibility to continue to be registered as a charity.
What advice is the ACNC giving charities in this area, and how has it changed? It's been slightly tweaked and updated, like you've always had advice there, but you've revisited it in time for this election. Is that correct?
Yes, we have recently updated our guidance. We always like to do that in any event, but particularly when we know there's an event coming and more people will be looking at it. There's no substantive change at all to the guidance. So people don't need to worry if they've been across it before. There's not any substantive change at all. What we always try and do is make sure we've got some relevant, FAQs at the end. If we're getting queries to our advice line or when we're out talking to the sector, we try to make sure we add in those questions at the end of the guidance. So nothing more than tweaks. The substantive position hasn't changed.
Will you be actively monitoring charities and advocacy efforts during the campaign? Like, I understand that you put up the guidance and you're flagging it charities' attention. It's a timely thing to do. But how do you approach that? Do you have a bit of a watching brief on the sector as a whole, or only if it's brought to your attention?
Well, our compliance approach is always a bit of both. But mostly in this situation, which is, a short period and a particular event, most of what we would notice, I suppose, will be in the daily media monitoring we do and also in concerns that are raised directly with us. And those concerns can come from the public, they can come from other agencies, but primarily our experience in election campaigning is that they would come from the public who are concerned about the actions of a particular charity.
I did note you're up in estimates the other week, which probably comes around very quickly for people like yourself, doesn't it? It didn't seem like you were there that long before and you're up again. It's part of the democracy, it's a good thing. But I noticed you said at estimates that I think the ACNC had about 500 concerns in the lead up to the previous federal election around charitable advocacy. Is that a lot? And did that surprise you to that extent? Or?
Yeah, it's a good point that you make. I wasn't the commissioner at the time, and I don't have lots of different benchmarks, but I probably wasn't surprised that, in a heightened period you can get that number of complaints. Sometimes it'll be, lots of complaints about a particular charity, for example. So sometimes the number itself isn't the best measure. And in fact, it was 500 complaints about 39 different charities. So when you think of, at that time, it would have been 60,000 registered charities to have 39 that have had, a query raised about what they're doing. It's not a really high percentage, but certainly one that we'll be looking at.
No, that's fair. That's fair enough. 39 out of 60,000 odd organisations. Yeah, isn't a huge amount. What measures are in place? Not to sanction charities, I suppose, if they cross the line, but to pull them up. How does that work if it is brought to your attention, or you are watching and somehow you inadvertently or they push the line too far? What are the steps that happen then re organisations in around charitable advocacy?
The same as is always the case when we've got concerns about a charity. In the vast majority of cases, we would contact the charity, we would raise our concerns, and we try to get them back on track as quickly as possible. And sometimes, perhaps particularly in scenarios like this, the experience was that a phone call to the charity to say, look, do you need any extra information? Did you understand the rules? This concerns, in a broad sense, has been raised with us, or it's something we've seen in the media ourselves. We just need to remind you, and that's usually enough for most people to go, oh, thank you, okay, fair enough. We'll that was a volunteer that got overly enthusiastic, or actually we didn't even realise that had been in the media under our name. So sometimes it's as simple as that. There might be situations where it's much more serious, in which case we have got our normal formal powers. We always hope not to use them. Our much preferred approach is to do the education piece and encourage people to get back on track.
Do those powers, does that end up being, in extreme cases, would be fines or deregistration, or like you go through a whole lot of hoops before you get to that point? But is that the process that it kind of goes through if there's a breach?
I guess in the most egregious situation, in the most serious situation, the ultimate power here is to revoke a charity status. That would never be done lightly, and there's a whole amount of procedural fairness that comes with that. It's never just a surprise. It's never just a letter that says, oh, by the way, we've taken you off the register. So it's certainly something a charity would have plenty of time to respond to and opportunities to correct behaviour, particularly in a situation like this. And that's not a power we rush to use. We're always going to be looking at, well, how's this happened? What steps has the charity taken to remedy it? Are they working with us? But yes, that ultimately is the power. And if a charity is doing that sort of party political advocacy, so, actively campaigning for a particular candidate or a particular party, then that might amount to what we would call a disqualifying purpose. That's just a fancy word for saying they might therefore no longer be eligible. They might be disqualified because of that behaviour from being able to be on the register. So that's why the revocation power becomes relevant.
What part of the guidance that you have, do you know off the top of your head what the most common, if there was a transgression, is there one area over any others that charities are more likely to, inadvertently fall foul of, or not particularly?
Some of the tips we give in the guidance, I think, sort of show the path there. Making sure that your volunteers and your paid staff understand what capacity they're speaking in. So, are they doing it in their private capacity? Could they in any way be said to be representing the charity? It's always really important. People understand that their charity's reputation is everything. So you've really got to have close reminder or control over who is speaking for and on behalf of your charity. So that's often an area where if someone's gone wrong, that we can see that there's a problem there. Certainly being very careful. It's absolutely fine, for example, to score the policies of the parties. So if you're working in the homelessness space, you might want to score the parties on their policies around social housing and low-cost housing and homelessness funding, and scoring all the parties on a sheet, especially where you've got research that shows why you've formed your policy views, and it's very clearly linked back to your charitable mission. Then that's fine. But if someone has done something like that and then put right across the bottom, therefore vote for naming a particular person, then that's a situation that would cross the line.
Yeah, no, that's pretty clear. And like you say, every charity organ do themselves a favour by looking at the advice if they are even remotely going there, advocating in the run-up to the election. On a related issue, but not exactly the same, are you concerned about what appears to be apparently inadvertent constraints on charitable advocacy that have come into force under the federal government's recently passed electoral reforms? I know that wasn't the intent. It was more around, introducing caps on political donations and spending. But as you'd be aware, there's a bit of sound and fury around the Stronger Charities Alliance trying to call out some circumstances where that could impact on charities. Did you have a view on that? I know that legislation's passed now and they're working with Don Farrell and the government to mitigate that. But, yeah, did you have a view on that legislation?
Well, that's legislation about, as you say, the funding side of it, which isn't our remit. But I I certainly am aware of the concerns about the sector have about the perhaps unintended consequences of that for their advocacy. What I would note, though, perhaps so people aren't confused right here and right now, that legislation has been passed and come into effect, but the provisions about the funding, the reporting of any funding, do not come into effect until next year. So they're not applicable for this election. There are existing provisions that do apply, certain caps or are more about disclosure of that funding. So charities, that are in that space, and that's probably a fairly small percentage that meet that criteria. And we certainly in our guidance make sure we link to the Australian Electoral Commission's guidance because it's their legislation and they are the experts on that. So we certainly try to make sure that for comprehensive guidance we've got that link to the AEC. And when we get past this election and we're looking into future elections where these provisions could apply, I want to assure people that we will continue to work closely with the AEC to make sure the guidance is clear and as practical as possible.
No worries. Well, thanks. Was there anything else you'd like to say around the advocacy issue and the ACNC? Or
perhaps sort of the key message here is that advocacy in an election campaign is fine. You just need to understand the rules. The main rules, sort of 3 key points maybe to remember, are that always think back to your purpose as your guiding light, your mission. So, what are we here to do? That helps guide you to know if the advocacy you're doing is related to your charitable purpose, always important. Main thing is you're not looking partisan, you're not choosing and advocating, supporting, promoting a particular party or a particular candidate. And always make sure, to preserve your public trust and confidence in your charity by abiding by the law. So, you don't want your campaigning to cross into areas like trespass, defamation, racial vilification, or any of those areas. So I think if you keep your purpose in mind, make sure you don't cross the line about being party political and keep it respectful.
So, as a sage advice from the regulator, you can't be blamed for not at least putting out those guidelines before we get into the election proper. So I'm sure most charities will take a look at that and try and act accordingly. Thanks again for your time, Sue. Always a pleasure to catch up. Join us again next time for another edition of the Community Advocate podcast.